warm welcome. This is Reda Setki from the Geneva Learning Foundation, and today is the opening of the Teach to Reach conference with the largest gathering of immunization practitioners from over 90 countries who are all getting ready to introduce the COVID-19 vaccine or are already doing it in more than 50 countries. I'm here with the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning. So we have George Siemens, Vitomir Kovanovic, and Sasha Poquet. And they are learning analytics specialists and have been working closely with the Geneva Learning Foundation during the pandemic. We're going to talk about what exactly they've been doing, how they've been doing it, and what their thoughts are as educators on what this means for action successfully winning the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's dive right in with the first question. What is, in fact, learning analytics? Vita?
Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Vitomir Kovanovic. I'm a senior lecturer at Center for Change and Complexity in Learning. And yeah, so what is learning analytics? So learning analytics in a nutshell is a field of study of how we can use educational data about students and how they learn to really understand how to help them and how to improve learning and how to improve the way we teach. So, for example, collecting with all of these digital technologies, we are collecting all kinds of data. And whether it's the students posting certain discussions, messages, talking to one another, watching videos, all of these things leave the traces of data, certain breadcrumbs in the background that we can use really and analyze and see, okay, certain things need improvement, will we need certain, how to help them, which students need feedback, and so on.
Right. So from your perspective as educators and learning analytics specialists, what is the COVID-19 Peer Hub? Vita, you've been working with us for more than 6 months. Yeah. How would you describe and define it concisely and promptly?
Yeah. So really, to me, as from my perspective, I see it really as one big community of people who come together to solve a specific problem, which is probably the biggest problem we are facing right now, and that's the COVID-19. Really a group of, it's somewhere in between educational network and practitioner network. I think it's really both. So people who are trying to solve a specific problem, help one another, share ideas, share experiences, and through that, really do something practical.
So you research and you also design, develop, run massive open online courses known as MOOCs. What is different about the Peer Hub compared to MOOCs?
Well, one big difference is focus, first of all. In this case, typically MOOCs have much more focus towards, for example, students and people who are really still in training. Many participants in MOOCs are people who just want to learn about specific domain. Here we're talking about very practitioner-oriented group, people who really work in the trenches, really solving the crisis, and that's what is different primarily to me. There are other things. For example, there's no. It's far more intrinsic motivation for participation into something like COVID-19 Peer Hub. It's really not driven by specific need for certification or anything, primarily driven by solving a real world problem.
So Vita, you've been working quite intently on this and doing this during the pandemic. Can you summarize what has been your contribution to developing the Peer Hub?
Okay, so our contribution as a center here was really around understanding what kind of data do we have there, first of all, and then seeing how we can make use of this data, putting all of the pieces together that we have, whether it's certain survey, the ways, all of these digital data that are there, to combine and get some information about, first of all, how to improve Peer Hub, and how to see what's happening there, but also more importantly to provide some evidence of helping around COVID-19.
So what for you were the most surprising, maybe the most interesting dynamics that you observed looking at the Peer Hub data and helping us to make sense of it?
So to me, as I'm coming somebody from not in immunization, so that one thing that I've been talking with you and other people in your team, what things that seem striking is the ability of people from Peer Hub to communicate through boundaries. So often those practitioners are typically focused on their local area, and this thing enables them to cross that boundary. For example, we have somebody in a hospital in Nigeria sharing ideas with somebody from subnational level in Pakistan. Probably two of them won't be having much interactions, especially during the pandemic. So even if we have other forms of professional development or typical training models, that they're not happening during pandemic, obviously. So this is really an amazing thing for fast spread of ideas. And that's really, and we really see that in the data, which is fascinating.
Do you feel that with this work you've been stepping outside the bounds of education, outside of what you usually do, helping to collect, analyze, interpret data from practitioners who are learning to work together as a distributed network? How close is that to what C3L does?
I would personally say we didn't, well, we do that, right? Collect the data, analyze from practitioners as well. So that's not unusual. What is unusual is really the domain and the engagement of these people in the practice. So we will be collecting the data from, say, it's one thing analyzing, say, engineers in a certain company having their professional development. The other thing is on a massive global scale, distributed immunization professionals. Plus the domain is obviously something we never done before. So that's quite new and challenging.
I want to open up the next two questions, and here it gets a little bit complicated. One of our partners, a very seasoned immunization trainer, her response was to be both shocked and fearful when she observed two things. One, the scale at which we work. And second, we have lots of people in the room or lots of people connected to each other and the uncertainties that we face. So for example, in synchronous session, we've got hundreds of people. We select one in the room simply because they raised their hand. We don't know what they're going to say. We can't prescribe what they're going to say. Maybe there's a small chance we know the person or we recognize the name. But her concern was that we only heard a fraction of the voices in the room. The rest were reduced to a passive listening role. And that didn't consider what you know, Vita, and what you've been helping us with, which is make sense of everything else that happens outside of these synchronous moments. And those moments are important primarily for the emotional power of everyone being connected to everyone. But that seemed completely foreign to her. How would you respond to someone who is shocked or fearful about the consequences of new kinds of practices that don't look like what they're used to? What do you think is going on in that exchange when someone who's deeply invested, deeply committed to training and has been for years, responds with shock and fear?
I think this really comes down to whole idea of informal learning. So what we really see here is, yes, we pick one person. That's true, right? We the other 199 weren't heard. Yes, but we also that's not the only way they engage to one another. There are all kinds of other ways. They have sharing of ideas, they have their project, they have their own other their action plans, they're having peer evaluation, they have country groups, they engage in many other ways. And that's one thing. And the other is really what we have here is not on one hand, this is learning specific things. The other is really taking ownership of them. So as in one of the chats we talked with one of the colleagues said, the main part is that we have a group of people who are self-motivated enough to come together without any monetary incentives and learn and share best practices to one another. So even if maybe we sitting in New York or Geneva know what is the best, that's not the way to teach that. It's from top down. It's far more effective to learn, to allow them to share experience with one another. That's much easier to get people to adopt those best practices that maybe somebody sitting in New York knows what is the best practice, but it's not about that. It's about how to get them adopted. And as people who share those experiences, share the same stories or similar stories, they'll much better to learn from one another that way.
So in 2019, way before the COVID-19 Peer Hub, one of our main partners told us, describe what we do, and she said, what you do is magic. And that was, of course, a nice compliment, but it also showed that this partner didn't necessarily understand how we do it. And in fact, partners are constantly asking us to share the how. So there's two questions for you here from the perspective, from your perspective as educators. First is complexity. How do you explain or describe complex learning? And second, how do we as an organization and a network protect an approach, a set of processes when like say IP, intellectual property law, is really focused on protecting products, patents, services, not sort of abstract approaches. What makes it difficult or challenging in your view to replicate something like the COVID-19 Peer Hub?
Well, one thing that seems is it is challenging, right? Especially protecting those IP, because it reminds me in many ways to academia in itself, right? We are talking about sharing ideas, sharing knowledge, and if the goal is to achieve something practical and solve a specific problem, so that's, I guess, the primary goal. So the other parts are secondary, and there will be, for example, for organizations such as TGLF, ways to develop those techniques for protection. However, for example, somebody coming up with a great idea and sharing with others, that's will be adopted by others, and which is great in my opinion. That at least that's how the progress is happening. But I think that desire for protection shouldn't be stopping advance. I don't know what others think. George, do you want to?
Sure, and I think Vita's raising some really good points, and I'm going to throw this ball to Sasha right after, because this is an area where she's clearly an expert as well. So regarding your point about complexity and complex systems and complex social interactions. So one way to look at complexity, well, I guess there's two ways. I'll try and explain it briefly, just as a way of differentiation. First of all, to just make a distinction between what is complicated and what is complex. A complicated system is one where every piece has a place. So an illustration would be if I have a car and I decide I'm going to do some work on it on the weekend, and I pull it apart and I put it back together. If I have springs and say a wheel left over that wasn't there before, that complicated system isn't working. I didn't do it the right way. A complex system is a little different. It's more like a weather pattern. You can model and understand complex systems, but what makes them unique is that they produce outputs that are sometimes not understandable directly. So you can say, well, if these conditions hold, we'll have this weather tomorrow. If those conditions don't hold, you'll have different weather. So instead of trying to deal with every piece in its place, you're trying to understand what are the influential factors that produce different outcomes. So that's one way of looking at the distinctions between the two. Specifically, a complex system, though, is one where there are granular level processes that produce, for lack of a better word, large level outcomes. The proverbial explanation for this is, a butterfly flaps its wings, say in China, and it produces a tornado in Texas, or some variation of that. It really just pays homage to the fact that we live in a closed ecosystem. Everything is connected. When you do global systems such as Peer Hub, where and humans in general, the very fact that COVID spread at the speed and pace that it did globally demonstrates just how interconnected we are. We can model the processes where it happened, who got on a flight, where and when, where it was first shown to be the case in US or in Australia or in Canada and so on. So we can model those things. But the reality is there are small scale behaviors that sometimes, when enough of them have collected, produce huge effects, good or bad in some cases. What's unique with a social system like Peer Hub that deals with these kinds of challenges, it basically is the challenge of being able to produce and guide people who are interacting and connecting on their own terms to have the end result be more knowledgeable population across 90 countries that are involved with vaccination. So in that sense, complex, when you're dealing with complexity in social systems, it's that positive effect of individuals at a ground level doing interesting things, producing aggregate knowledge that impacts the entire system.
All right, Sasha?
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things to what has been said already by Vida and George. I think one of the unique things that I found about the practices that Geneva Learning Foundation puts out for the immunization professionals is this ability not to move this paradigm from the reductionist teaching training. This is the content we're going to develop, and then we're going to package that and push it out to you. And I think that the way the practices are structured pushes this towards this capability development paradigm that's completely different in its sort of notion. And you brought two things, Reda, in your question that sort of both are characteristic to this capability development paradigm. One is these higher order skills, right? So higher order skills is not learning gain. It's a lot more than just learning gain. And so we know that learning gain is taught linearly, and you do need a certain sort of guided practice to develop or acquire information. But capability development is a lot more than that, and it requires sort of open-ended and engaged and learning that learners take ownership of. And so in that sense, scholars engaged with these information sharing around their interests, and they own and produce ideas that where they can push their own thinking and their own skills and their own competences way beyond what sort of the information that's intended. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is that something that we also discussed quite a bit in the center, but I honestly haven't seen an educational provision that so nicely develops or tries to support learners in developing what's called complexity leadership. So it's an ability to navigate different parts of the system, putting different heads on, taking on leadership in situations where you may not be a leader, and also being aware of the sort of problems that may arise and having social support to draw on. And I think that what Peer Hub does is that it allows scholars to develop these resources to draw on, to take on these leadership roles on the ground. And so Vida talked a little bit about the data and what the data sort of the work that he's been enabling with looking at the practices and how things are structured. What I've seen in how Peer Hub functions is that you bridge the ground between developing groups that are based on interest and groups that are based on personal relationships. So that our research shows that there are social relationships being formed in all sorts of different structures that support learners, and that basically enables their learning and capability development beyond just sharing in this given instant, but it enables them to go back to the connections they formed. And so that's really unique, because you tap on these very different aspects that are essential to basically working in complex situations that are constantly changing.
So Sasha, I have a follow-up question for you about that, because you referred to this idea of pushing out content, and to go back to that sort of old school trainer in response to say, so she will diagnose a performance gap. People in the district don't know how to manage projects, and she will send a team of trainers to show people how to manage projects. And for most people in immunization, that seems like a reasonable proposition. When it comes to what you're describing, in particular developing these higher order skills, is that sort of pushing out content necessary, and is it sufficient?
Well, it depends on the end goal, right? I think it is insufficient, mainly because we live in a time where we know that knowledge changes. And so what we know to be true today may actually be only partially true tomorrow. So what you need to know is you need to be situated within systems where you're agile enough to learn and draw on other people's practices and ideas and behaviors, and to be able to adapt. And so I think that's where the difference is between the sort of the reductionist training paradigm. Sure, if I tell you how to do something, you're going to know how to do it, but we don't know what we will need to know tomorrow, right? And we, especially in the COVID situation, we've experienced how knowledge changes so rapidly when we are in these situations. So being a part of the resilient structure where people can adapt quickly and also have trusted sources to go to is a lot more valuable and sustainable just than having, losing trust in expertise that's been, shaped in a book form, so to speak, or cut in stone, or claimed to be. I hope that addresses it to some extent.
So we're here at the Teach to Reach conference talking with George Siemens, Vitomir Kovanovic, and Sasha Poquet from the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning. They've been researching, studying the COVID-19 Peer Hub developed by thousands of immunization professionals from over 90 countries. I want to now turn to the Teach to Reach conference, and already a week before the conference, more than 5,000 immunization professionals had already registered for this event. No travel or per diem needed. The recruitment for this conference, so the mobilization around this conference, has been led by this organizing committee of 282 alumni, enthusiastic, diligent, committed, from 35 countries who have been talking to their colleagues and explaining why this is important. And it's now become probably the world's largest gathering of immunization professionals right when the world is introducing COVID-19 vaccine or getting ready to do so. For educators, how do you look at, how do you make sense of an event like this? What does it look like to you? And what is your message to Teach to Reach participants? Let's start with Vita, then George, and then Sasha.
Sorry, Reda, can you repeat? Sorry.
So 2 questions. Is there anything that surprises you about an event like Teach to Reach? As an educator, when you look at an event like that, 5,000 immunization professionals coming together, what do you make of it? What's your message to participants at this conference?
So, well, for me, this is the first time being involved in something like this, to be honest. So it's very new to me. And one thing that I think is the most important thing is to really, be open to learning new meeting other people, learning from their experiences, and hearing how other people are experiencing, COVID-19, and getting some nice ideas and recommendations and suggestions on how to solve practical problems. That would be my view from as an educator. This is, I think, a very unique opportunity to get together in time like COVID and be able to share those experiences. Quite interesting and very, very positive thing.
All right, thanks, George.
Well, I think first of all, one of the things that I've found, not only just surprising in some ways, but also, delightful to see. And just as you noted, now you have one of the likely largest events on this topic being organized in a very timely manner. And it is being organized by people who've gone through the program. And I think that's exactly the network effect. So one way to look at it is that the same way that, say, a pathogen like, virus like COVID spreads through the population, there's a similar level of talent and skill development that occurs as well. Meaning if one person teaches another, who teaches another, who teaches another, you end up getting an amplification of effect that's far greater than a single individual person could actually do, or an organization could do. And one of the needs, and this is what you've done so well with the Geneva Learning Foundation, one of the needs is to create a platform or an infrastructure where that networked capability can occur. And the fact that you brought in alumni of the program to help organize this event, I think, is a great validation of the quality of the experience overall. In terms of advice or comments toward participants, there's probably the biggest point of focus that I'd emphasize is that these spaces, when you function and learn in social networks and social systems, it can get a little messy. It can feel a little chaotic at times, but the reality of it is that's how it works to connect and engage. And like Vita noted, be open to the experience. Quite often we've been taught through our school system often that the answer and the expertise is out there, right? We just need to find the person to give us the answer. But as you've discovered with Peer Hub and with others, the answer actually exists within the network. And Sasha touched on this earlier as well. Like, things are changing quickly. What we now know may not be as true tomorrow because of something that happened on the ground in a remote part of a country. Well, it takes a long time for established experts to get that information. But when there is the ability of people at these edges or these outlying parts of the system, they get that information real time. They share it with their peers, and then that in turn helps them solve problems, or other people solve problems in other areas. So I really want to emphasize that, in many ways, trust the network, trust the expertise of your peers at least as much as you trust experts. We always want to turn to expert and peer review science, but when it comes to practical implementation, you touched on this right at the start, when we were chatting about this, Retta, is you have different systems. You have individuals who meet and do the state and government level planning and organization. Then you have people who are actually on the ground doing the work. Those are different policy requirements, and you need to amplify the voices of the people on the ground doing the work so that their experiences can be shared with others who are in a similar position. So I'd really encourage participants to just focus on the value of the network as a type of expertise.
Thanks, George. Sasha?
Oh, just a little thing to add. I think that it's impressive the amount of commitment that people show to the problem and to each other. I mean, showing up for each other as well as the problem they care about. And I think, to me, the biggest impact of events like that is that when you're dealing with a problem on your own, in your own context, it may feel isolated. It may look like you're there fighting your own thing that's sort of much smaller than it actually is, but being a part of such a large group of committed people, then I'd encourage the participants to draw on that energy to keep them going through the hardships that they may encounter in making changes in their own context, because in reality there are so many people experiencing similar things, and I think that's what most striking to me, that the scale and the energy and the commitment within that.
Teach to Reach started as a series of 3 hotel-based conferences, beautiful face-to-face events. And Oren Levine, one of the senior folks at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2015 said, we're not on target, and business as usual for training and learning is not going to produce the results that we want to see. 6 years later, we just spoke to Violaine Mitchell, and she said, basically, a lot of what Oren said in 2015 is still just as true to this day. So through the lens of education, how would you explain that training known to be ineffective could prove so resistant to change, even when everybody in immunization acknowledges that change is very much needed and that the results we need are unlikely to be achieved by face-to-face workshops, 20 people at a time, showing PowerPoints to people, or their digital equivalent, having people click through screens and take a quiz at the end? Why is that so resistant to change?
Brett, if you don't mind, I'd love to dive in on that one. So one of the important aspects here is that systems speak to systems. And quite often, one of the same challenges you're just mentioning now is one that we face in higher education or education in general, which is, why is it so hard to drive change when we know what we should be doing in classrooms? And the reason is that the system from end to end has integrated with other parts of the system. So what I mean with that is the funding mechanism has integrated with a delivery mechanism, which has integrated with government KPIs or in performance indicators and so on. So when you do something like training and people are like, well, we know it doesn't work that well and we know there's problems, and it's like, well, government agencies and funders understand it, right? If somebody says, hey, this is a problem, and then somebody says, here's $200,000 to train 5,000 people, and that's what you go out and do. So I think at its very core, it's a systems problem. Systems, the way they're currently structured, are not able to work directly outside of that, the structure that's in place, the responsibility that one element within that system has. Now, what you've done, which I think is a great illustration, is you've taken the idea of still being part of a system, but instead of being a self-contained system, you've set yourself up as a platform to promote others to network and to connect. And that's, I think, why you've been successful with the instance that you've had, but it also, to emphasize, there's really great people who are developing, running, and delivering training. they often know it doesn't work well, but you can't just take one part out and just pretend it's going to work, or put something in that doesn't resonate with the other systems in which it's located. So it's a bit of a high level answer, but it's essentially just to say that there's a government agency funding doesn't know how to fund outside of the existing approaches they have. And that's why it's so difficult to drive change.
So the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, between 2011 and 2015 showed that dedicated more than $100 million to trainings and workshops, almost entirely face-to-face. And in reviewing this, that data was presented at the Teach to Reach in 2015, and reviewing the same sort of investments in 2020, Gavi found again that another $100 million had been spent. And global partners recently have been saying, well, we're not sure we can keep funding the same old that we've been doing, and questioning the effectiveness of what has been done in the past. And at the same time, there's a question about the level of investment, and how do we know if this is too much or too little? How do we actually quantify the return on investment of education? The stock answer is to say it's complicated. Yes, there are all these elaborate frameworks to try to measure the return on investment, to measure the and so on. What would be your message to senior decision makers in immunization who are trying to navigate that, who can see the need for change, and as you said that there's that system level, but who are trying to answer this question: how do we know how much we should spend? How do we know if we're getting the return we want on our investment?
Well, this is where certainly Vita and Sasha's expertise in things like analytics and learning analytics starts to become central. So one way to describe learning analytics, and Vita detailed exactly what the effect of it was earlier, what the field or the domain is about. We're looking at any kind of data that comes from any kind of a process or interaction. It could be an interaction in an online environment. It could be data that you add in the form of surveys, or it could be observational data that can be recorded and then made available digitally for others to look at or assess and analyze. So one way to describe data is that it is a scientific instrument to see things that can't be seen otherwise. You could look at that and say, well, it's like a microscope, right? A microscope allows you to see things on a slide that you can't see with the human eye. So it's an instrument for seeing things that are otherwise not visible. The same thing holds true with learning analytics. So in the case that you're talking about, where there's government agencies who are saying, what are we investing? Is it too much? Is it too little? What is the long-term impact or effect of what we're investing? And sort of your question, I'll just say quite simply, the way to navigate the scope and the landscape that you're addressing there is through learning analytics. It's through understanding the data, evaluating the data, determining the questions that you want to have answered, identifying which data sources you need to be able to meaningfully answer that question, and then putting in bright, talented, capable people to use sort of data science approaches to allow you to see what you cannot see otherwise.
In October 2020, 549 alumni of the Teach to Reach program created something that they call the Global Council of Learning Leaders for Immunization. And this is a voluntary group bringing together people from all countries, all levels of the system. And at the Teach to Reach conference, the founders of this group, of the Global Council, are going to share right now what is their individual visions for how to lead change, and they're going to call on the participants of the conference to join them. What do you think, again, through the lens of education, is the potential of such a diverse, voluntary, and in some ways improbable group? Why should such sort of cross-cutting initiatives, should this kind of leadership be supported by the global immunization partners? And again, from the perspective of education, why would this kind of initiative be worth supporting? What might come out of it in a global immunization community focused, laser focused on outcomes, on achieving specific global goals, and making a COVID-19 vaccine introduction a success? Who'd like to take that one?
So I can take that one. So, for example, asking why would we support something like that is, to me, just reminded me of Wikipedia. Why would we support a group of unknown people who are now suddenly devising probably the most important resource in humanity, right? So power, I think people don't realize well, not everybody realizes the power of volunteering, what volunteers can achieve, especially in the communities that are well nurtured, such as Peer Hub. So that's the first thing. So yes, that groups like that can have a significant impact of showing how from bottom up approach, really coming up to a certain idea, suggestions, recommendations, and so on. And that really not only just to get the knowledge, but actually help with the adoption. And that's a really critical thing. So even if we know what should be taught and how, that's a different thing how actually is going to be adopted in practice. And that's where groups such as this one can help.
All right, we are at a juncture in which manufacturing facilities for vaccines are being rapidly ramping up their capabilities to produce enough, hopefully, COVID-19 vaccines for everyone who needs them. Alongside that, there's an obvious need to develop in the capabilities of people. Looking back at the Ebola crisis, Anna Pethrick, this was way back in 2015 in the Lancet, said something like building new treatment centers was an easy task next to training and supervising people to staff them. And the primary lesson so far has not been about the need for new response methods, but about human resources and coordination. Yet the global investment so far has focused on building that vaccine capacity. And I want to reformulate this question. What are the risks? What bad things can happen if we have the vaccines, but we don't make the commensurate investment in developing the people in the ways that we've been discussing, not prescribing what they need to do and how, because they're so many different, every situation, every country, every context is different. But just doing the kind of education we've been talking about, what are the bad things that can happen if we don't make that investment? I'd like to ask each of you in turn, Vita, George, and Sasha, to close this interview on a less than optimistic note, but also on a realistic one.
So yeah, for the first part, so I mean, even we notice some of the things happening in certain countries. At least I'm not a professional, but just seeing in the news reports of vaccine being first of all expiring on shelf, which is almost unimaginable that things like that are happening. But on a more important note, obviously the bigger problem is adapting to the specific domain. So for example, specific local contests which will have problems with vaccine hesitancy. Things like that will be a real big challenge. And that's where top-down approaches or just focusing on production without really developing the capacity of people who can have big problems, especially in the developing worlds or certain parts of the world where there might be a bigger reluctance to vaccination. So that's really going to be a big problem if local context isn't taken into consideration when training.
George?
Well, I'll say to your question of the importance of investing in sort of the social or the human infrastructure as much as the technological, the distribution infrastructure. I think you touched on a really important and consequential point there, which is it's likely that this is the single largest global medical education event in human history. We have people around the world, essentially every country in the world, over the last 12 months already, having been brought up to speed on what is it we're dealing with, what does it look like, how do we treat it, how do we support people who have it, how do we stay safe as medical providers, vaccination issues as well, what's the impact of other vaccination programs when there's distrust with vaccines and COVID comes along and the list goes on. So recognizing that it is likely the largest global medical education event in human history, you would expect a corresponding investment in resources to support that and to make that happen. When we talk networks, like we have been in complexity, it's not that we're saying that just let things happen by themselves, right? People will work it out because they're in networks. No, there needs to be an organizing infrastructure. There needs to be points of support, points of verification or validation of what people know and are able to do. It's not a free-for-all. It's just a different organizational structure that pays greater recognition to the importance of edge cases or people who are out doing the actual work, there's a feedback infrastructure that's enabled that allows them to come in and have their voices be heard in that regard. So I think recognizing and being clear of the scale of what we're experiencing as a society, definitely in the medical field, requires a related investment in the social and the human knowledge capabilities within that system.
And Sasha?
So I wouldn't know about the immunization context as much, but to me this is very similar to adopting technology, just planting a piece of hardware in a social context and expecting that miracles will happen. So sometimes they will happen because the context was ready to receive, or there were some things that sort of gelled and ta-da, we see the desired effect. But in reality, in most cases, we're looking at a socio-technical system or socio-material system. And so if you just invest into material part of it, you're neglecting all the social factors that may not be in place. So what can happen, I don't know, but it certainly is not doing a complex intervention, but planning an intervention that's simple towards a complex context where it's just may not take off as planned. So that would be my comment here.
Thank you. We've been talking with the Center for Complexity and Change in Learning, based in Adelaide, Australia, with George Siemens, Vitomir Kovanovic, and Sasha Poquet at the Teach to Reach conference. It's not too late. You can still join the conference. You can still get your ticket. Go to the Geneva Learning Foundation website and look for Teach to Reach. I want to now thank and acknowledge those of you who've been sending messages during the recording of this session. So hello to Mohammed Mubashir, to Dr. Tanushree Mondal from West Bengal, Godwin Tolonu, who does disease surveillance in Nigeria, Dr. Moses, Rebecca Bello, Dr. Alfonso, greetings to you in Guinea, Joseph and Gugi from Kenya, Steve from Kenya, Mohammed Hamayoun, who's connecting with us on LinkedIn, and Dr. Kanwal Shakil Koja, and Dr. Taimur Kayani from Pakistan. That's it for this session. Look forward to seeing you throughout the Teach to Reach Accelerator Conference.